My name is Nick Payton-Walsh. I work for Channel 4 News, and let me introduce my panel. They can introduce themselves. This is Mary.
Mary Drzewski. I work for The Independent as the main editorial writer, and I write columns as well. My claim to be here is that I was Moscow correspondent for The Times between 1988 and 92, which was during the fall of communism, and that I've been back since regularly, the last time in September this year.
I'm Daria Pushkova. I work as London correspondent for a TV channel called Russia Today, which is a relatively, well, a very new channel. We're only 2 years old. It's a 24-hour news channel broadcasting in English worldwide, and we're a state channel, therefore some do say that it's a propaganda channel, but some actually say that it's quite a balanced channel. So if you're willing to have your own opinion, you're very welcome to tune in. We're on Sky on channel 516, and you can watch us online on basically logging on www.rttv.ru.
Very honest.
And I'm Andrew Jack from the Financial Times, and I was Moscow correspondent and bureau chief of the paper from '98 until 2004, and also last time in September, together in fact, in Moscow.
And I probably should mention I used to work for The Guardian. I'm not just here because I work in television. I was their bureau chief for about 4.5 years, from 2002 to last August. I don't quite know where to start. I probably ought to... Yes, of course. We should be having one more person here, which is Robert Service, the distinguished historian of Russia, and believe this as you will, he has food poisoning and therefore can't make it. So, not imagination, not obviously being his strong point on that. But anyway, so thank you all for coming. The title of this debate is supposed to be Cold War II, which to me seems a little bit preposterous because the Cold War happened and we won, and that's part of the problem at the moment. But I was wondering if we could start by asking Mary whether she thinks the recent, I think it's fair to say, the recent 2 or 3 years of increasing panic in the West about a resurgent Russia is justified, or whether it's just people going back to old stereotypes after 40 years of hating each other, whereas it's easier to do that than kind of function normally and develop a new relationship.
I think a lot of it's explained by going back to old stereotypes. If you look at how Russia is portrayed a lot across the media, even now, there is a sort of assumption that a Cold War exists, even though it's almost 20 years since the end of the Soviet Union. The second thing that I would say is that the various manifestations that are brought out in support of the idea that there's a new Cold War, that Russians have become more aggressive, they're flying their fighters near NATO airspace, they're clamping down on the media, they're stopping protest demonstrations, that a lot of these things are actually much more complicated than they're presented, first, and second, that most of them have actually been provoked by actions on the part of the West. In particular, the latest, the overflying, which I think was the thing close to NATO airspace, which I think is what caused the most alarmist talk about a new Cold War, is actually a direct response to two things. It's a response to NATO planes flying near the eastern borders of NATO, close to the Estonia-Russia border, which Russia feels is a violation of an undertaking that it was given when it effectively turned a blind eye to NATO expansion. And the second reason is because of the American President Bush's plans for installations, Star Wars II installations in the former Eastern Bloc. And Russia is not happy about that, as we've seen in the last couple of weeks.
Is there a presumption, possibly, that because Russia feels it's different, that, for example, many other countries don't complain so much about Americans flying over their territory, that somehow Russia feels it has, because of its history, a right to object and to be taken differently?
I don't think so. I mean, my impression is that they feel that their military and Putin feel that they had an undertaking when NATO expanded that there would be no flights close to the eastern border. Now, you know, if you talk to NATO people, they say, no undertaking, we couldn't possibly give that sort of undertaking. NATO expands, it's NATO, it's a NATO border, we have every right to patrol it. But the Russians feel that that's not the understanding they have, so that when these flights began, they regarded that as a violation.
So it's a loss of trust, basically, between.
It's definitely a loss of trust, yes.
And do you think, I don't know, completely change the topic, Andrew, do you think, given the last 6 months of coverage of Russian-British relations, you can't really not mention the word Litvinenko and what's happened around that. There was a very public media process in which that was debated and people were throwing accusations very easily and very directly. Do you think that that could have damaged further the sense of trust between Moscow and London, or is that a just justifiable public debate about somebody's clear and calculated murder?
Yes, no, I mean, of course, in the wake of Robert Service's food poisoning in Litvinenko, I'm going to have to be a bit careful what I say this evening.
It's not a joking matter.
But no, there is an interesting issue about how the relative position of Russia compared to the West and how it changes over time. You know, going back to Mary's point, I think, you know, it's striking. Everyone's made a lot of emphasis on what Putin said pretty recently about, you know, sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and so on. But the irony is, you know, you could go back to some of Putin's speeches in 99, 2000, and if you'd wanted to, you would have found an awful lot of that same rhetoric, which is to say, I think the attitude of the West towards Russia has probably changed in many ways more than Russia's actual attitude as the West. I think there has been quite a lot of selective reporting, and it's certainly true. Well, first of all, I have to say, objectively, you know, on the Litvinenko case, you know, clearly something deeply disturbing took place. You don't have to be an Albert Einstein to see that there were some rather intriguing connections to some rather difficult to obtain materials, and it would be hard to say there wasn't some degree of quasi-official involvement or endorsement or incompetence that led to its passage into the UK.
Should we just ask the audience, who here thinks Putin directly ordered the murder of Litvinenko?
Well, I don't, for what it's worth.
You're discounted, so that's 3 people.
But,
sorry, carry on.
yeah, but I would say that, I mean, certainly in the wake of that, you know, I mean, this is, you know, it's bad enough when you get sort of general journalists writing about Russia without much knowledge or having ever been there. It's, you know, it's a bit like when suddenly Abramovich suddenly turns from a Russian oligarch into a football proprietor, and suddenly the sports journalists go in, and now, you know, a UK domestic story, everyone piles in, and then instantly all the sort of stereotypes come to the fore, and there's no doubt there was a total trial by, you know, instinct, prejudice and stereotype, I think, that we probably haven't seen in any scale equivalent for the last decade or 20 years, maybe.
Sure. And Dario, someone living in London during that, you were living in London during that, yeah? What was it like for you? Did it seem preposterous, or could you understand how this process was developing? Was it you could see a rational debate happening?
Well, I definitely felt it probably in the first place because I was in the middle of it and I had to report on that, which was quite hard among all the speculation. And in the end, I just ended up saying, well, here's what the police say, here's what the people say, and here's what the media say, which were 3 different things, because the police wouldn't say anything, or they would release very little information that would be official information. The people were saying, well, it's a scary thing, but, you know, it's all those murky games, politicians, whereas we're interested. Russia's a great country. Russia's an interesting country. We would be interested to go there. Whereas the media were literally, it was, you know, there was a very interesting period. For the first week, everybody was pretty much pointing the finger at Putin almost directly and saying, it's the Russian president who's behind this. And then, as if somebody called everyone up and said, what on earth are you talking about? People changed the tune and said, well, if it's not Putin, then it's the people around him. There must be this dirty circle. So in that sense, I was slightly surprised by the coverage in the United Kingdom, because I used to work for the BBC back in Moscow. I know what the standards are among British journalists in terms of coverage, in terms of how every single fact you're reporting should be substantiated. And I found quite a few things on it were not substantiated. Indeed, it was a scary thing, but it sort of showed how little we have moved away from the old ways of thinking. But at the same time, getting to the point that it's easy to fall back to those 40 years. I don't think it's going to remain that way, because just look at the world. The Russians have got out of the country. The borders, even with a visa regime, have sort of opened up. There are so many Russians. Abramovich comes here and buys a club. I think the Russians will sort of start mingling and mixing into the international arena, and then everybody will get used to that, and the reports will not be so one-sided.
Now, if you go back to Litvinenko, do you think had Putin wanted to push the button, that when he actually done that it would have worked, or would the machine have smoked and the sparks flown? And isn't this partly the problem, that the vision of Russia as being a functioning authoritarian state, when if you actually go there, it's pretty much chaos?
Well, I'd like to say two things. I mean, I think in response to that particular question, could Putin actually press the button and that would happen? I think possibly if he had ordered that, and I don't believe he had, that he would have the power to do that particular thing and to make it happen. What I don't think is the general view, which says that Putin is a dictator in the making, a Tsar of Russia, an effective autocrat who's seeking more and more power. I think that view is actually wrong. I think that a lot of the legislation that he's enacted, abolishing elections for governors, for instance, and some of the constitutional changes that have been made, can actually be explained by Putin's sense of weakness, that he has power in the Kremlin, but how far his writ runs in Russia at large, I think, is a very big question. I think that the Russians haven't completed, by a long way, the transition from top-down power of the Soviet period to a sort of bottom-up power of a democratic country, and that's still incredibly in flux, and that Putin is actually quite a weak leader when it comes to making happen what he would like to happen across the country.
Is that why he's staying on? I mean, sorry, just to fill people in here, but know that we have Putin, who's said for years, and people around him have said for years, he's tired, he's going home, he's had enough, he doesn't want another 4 years running one of the most complicated, messy countries in Europe.
Have they really said that he's tired?
Well, one person did, and he was fairly close to him. I don't know, you don't get to speak to that many people who are close to Putin. So, anyway, but the indication was he was going and there would be a successor, and then suddenly, a month ago, we hear that he's staying on as Prime Minister, probably not entirely clear. Do you think he's doing that because of reported fighting between his own kind of KGB guard around him, that he needs to control the succession really carefully? If he lets it up to, God's sake, the Russian people, it will go horrendously awry.
I've never believed that Putin would stay on as president beyond his second term, because his rationale for that seems to have got stronger and stronger every time he talks about it. He says that if I, as president, defy the Constitution, then how can you expect everybody else to observe the Constitution? And I tend to believe him when he says that he sees his role as a sort of guardian of the Constitution and as such sort of transitional figure to Russian democracy. Now I can see the degree of scepticism in the audience, but that's my view. When he came out and told his party on being nominated as its leader that he might become Prime Minister, to me, that didn't have nearly the same weight as his, it was much more speculative than his protestations that he would not stay on as president. I remain to, if it happens, okay, then I'll believe it. At the moment, I find it very difficult to believe. I see it much more as a tactic to try and keep the leadership in line at a time when it seems to be fragmenting, anticipating his departure.
So who would you put your money on as the next president of Russia?
Someone pretty weak, and I think the problem is, you know, this. I mean, I don't quite agree with Mary in the sense that, you know, I think clearly Putin does want to create a more centralized system, but I also think that what we're seeing now is, you know, even if there was a desire 8 years ago, 4 years ago, maybe even a year ago, to hand over to a successor as president, you know, what's coming home to roost is the fact that Putin has been unable, and perhaps this is partly his problem, partly it's also the nature, of course, of Russia. He's been unable to create a system where strong, competent successors can emerge within this current political structure. So he's perpetuated a system which is driven by an individual, him in this case. And so what's he doing now? Well, he's basically recognizing, and in my view, to some degree, flailing around to try and find somebody to at least nominally be president, but also to not be captive to one or other interest group that's emerged or survived over the last 8 years. And so even if he was tired, even if he wanted to give up power, I think he feels his legacy would collapse if he did so. So, I mean, you know, he may not be president, but, you know, as he said to us in pretty much those words about a month ago, whoever will be president will have to reckon with me, basically, in the period ahead. He hadn't at that stage. Probably, he may not even have decided, he certainly hadn't formalised this idea that he would basically become Prime Minister, but I think it's pretty clear that, you know, that Putin as Prime Minister will not be Fradkov as Prime Minister. This will be someone who's much more active and interventionist and wants and hopes, whether or not successfully we'll see, to be continuing to be controlling the system.
There's something interesting between all of us. We aren't particularly insulting towards Putin, which is something you would normally expect to see from Western journalists. I was here 2 weeks ago for a memorial night, partially for Anna Politkovskaya, and there was a much more negative vibe about the Kremlin there. Darren, do you feel sometimes when you see Western journalists who've been in Russia too long that they kind of lose perspective and decide that actually it's okay that Putin is the only person who could feasibly be in power in Russia? Possibly ever.
I actually prefer those journalists who worked in Russia long enough to start understanding what is going on there, and some even tend to write party articles, which are quite different to what they were.
I live the rest of my life.
But anyway, what I mean is that when somebody comes full of stereotypes from movies like Eastern Promises to Russia and brings them with them and starts covering Russia, that's very different to what people who have been there for 10, 15 years would probably write. So in that sense, I prefer the journalists who know things about Russia and speak Russian. But also, the point that I wanted to make, there is so much discussion about Putin's foreign policy, about why we're also concerned about what he's doing outside Russia. But the point, a very important point is, I've been watching today for an interminable amount of time, for 3 hours, Putin's good questions and answers, and the majority of questions were not about foreign policy, were not about the state. I mean,
Russians weren't going to go, well, how do you feel
obviously,
about Burma?
but also they were, people are concerned about their own country, and there is a lot of acknowledgement that there are a hell of a lot of problems inside Russia, which still haven't been sorted now, 16 years on, right, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in that sense, Russia is still very much preoccupied with itself, and it only comes to harsher statements and sort of some actions when Russia feels a bit cornered, or when it comes down to what it feels are its national interests. So we may be discussing Russia's, aggressive foreign policy, but it's a reactive policy. It's not a policy that is of a conqueror.
You were probably there for the period when Putin started, where he seemed all friendly and pro-Western, and Afghanistan, great, and Iraq, well, maybe not. But there was sort of a moment where he appeared schizophrenic, where for domestic audiences he would say Yabu sucks to America, and then on the international stage be very respectable, at least not drunk and polite. Do you feel that he's kind of two sides of his personality have come closer together, if we can give him a personality? What do you think?
I mean, I think initially Putin was quite courageously pro-Western at a time when it was rather difficult to be so domestically. He was certainly sticking his neck out beyond what most of his advisors and what the ordinary Russian people would have said. My understanding was when first of all, when 9/11 happened, famously he was the first international leader to call George Bush, and it took a rather long time to find him because Bush was sort of hiding between various planes and bunkers. He then apparently he had quite a long sort of think session with various sort of senior officials out of Moscow. He came back to Moscow. He had a large session with the leaders of the different parliamentary fractions. and the opinions were everything from, you know, well, in the case of Zhirinovsky, bomb America and support the Taliban, through to the vast majority, which was essentially, you know, well, we should just sort of slam the door and shrug our shoulders and let America and the West deal with this. And Putin went much further, as we know, in terms of providing intelligence, and heaven knows the Russians, the Soviet Union, had much better knowledge of Afghanistan than the Americans or the Westerners did. And he did provide some very concrete support. Now, I first met Putin in 2001, and it was actually a very symbolic time. It was the evening of the day when George Bush had ripped up the ABM Treaty, which was, you know, 25 years of intercontinental strategic stability. And this was, I think, probably, you know, a key moment in that shift, you know. And basically, if you talk to Russian officials since that time, they say, you know, we took a quite courageous stance. We came out. We wanted to cooperate. There was a moment when Putin was even discussing Russia explicitly becoming a member of NATO. And essentially, what did they get back? You know, Jackson-Vanik, which dates from the early 70s, was never reformed. WTO and some sort of economic gestures were always spurned, or, you know, there were new conditions imposed that were never imposed on many other former Soviet states in the hemisphere that were allowed in, many other countries that were in many ways much less liberal in their economic policy. And you had a succession of these sorts of slaps in the face. And so I think it's not really very surprising. And then, of course, we had Iraq. And, you know, it has to be said, looking back at what Putin said at the time, there was a fair degree of wisdom to his argument.
In terms of his kind of, oh, it's terribly unfair, we were so nice to you in 2001, and now weren't they a little naive? I mean, this is the world's only superpower recovering from a terrorist attack. They just won the Cold War. Why would they say, well, it's very kind you're playing ball, here's access to, I don't know, NORAD?
Well, were they naive? I mean, I think there was a degree of openness and willingness to cooperate, which did reflect a spirit that wasn't reciprocated. And I think, you know, had Tony Blair known then what he's known since, you know, would he have been so positive to George Bush, for example? You know, I think one could argue in that case, you know, if Putin was naive, so was much of the rest of the world. So yes, he's changed his position, he's hardened. There's no doubt the message more recently has been as much for domestic as for international consumption. You know, in that sense, there's been perhaps a convergence or a retrenchment towards a slightly more Cold War style sort of policy stance, but, you know, nothing as aggressive as it was then.
Sure. Mary, do you think you could see the Kremlin in its next guise trying to ameliorate what's been happening over the last couple of years, soften things down, or are they stuck on a trajectory now where it can only get that people just want to hear them be more rude about the West?
It's very hard to say, because domestic politics, you know, every head of state pretty much, from George Bush downwards, has one message that they have for their domestic audience, and if they're clever politicians, they have another message which they put out to the rest of the world. And that if they're even cleverer, then those two messages don't contradict. I think one of the problems with Putin has been, until very, very recently, was that his domestic signals and his foreign signals got mixed up, and he didn't maybe understand quite how some of the things he said to his domestic audience played outside Russia. And it may be that whoever follows him, and if it's somebody like Sergei Ivanov, who is one of the favourites, I think he would be much cleverer about balancing the messages that he gives to the home audience and the foreign audience. But an awful lot of this depends on how the outside world behaves towards Russia. I mean, that's dictated a lot of the way Putin has responded now. I would like just to say something about Iraq, because I noticed today that in his phone-in, Putin said, in fact, the same thing that he said to us, which was that he thought the Americans ought to set a date for withdrawal. Now, the other impression, the overwhelming impression that came from asking Putin about Iraq was how generally understanding he seemed of America's predicament. I mean, the question we asked him was an opening for him to lambast Bush and America and say this was a ridiculous thing to do, we argued against it, look at the mess they've got themselves into, it's their own fault. That's not what he said to us. What he said was, well, you know, we disagreed with the decision, but we don't feel any schadenfreude about what's happened, and we're very concerned about the fate of Iraq, because Iraq's rather close to us, and if Iraq breaks up, what we end up with is something much worse. We end up with 4 Iraq problems rather than 1. And he was very definite about that, and I just felt that he was much more indulgent of Bush than one might expect. He wasn't scoring political points.
Darren, what do you think when you see Russian Bear bombers flying towards Britain?
I've actually spoken to some people, and they all tell me it's all totally legitimate.
Okay, fair enough. Just dropping stuff off.
No, but the thing is, it is true that Russia returning to the airspace, even for training, immediately arouses some concerns with our partners, with our allies, with our counterparts, whatever. But the thing is...
You must go, oh, hang on a minute. Part of you must think, why do we need to... particularly with propeller planes that look quite old and embarrassing.
We must
like
need some new planes, right? That would be it. No, but the thing is, with when NATO planes fly their, 300 hours, it's a normal thing. As soon as one old Russian bomber just gets out there, everybody says, ooh, well Cold War, they're scary. Yeah. So in that sense, I don't think it's a legitimate way of saying we are launching a new Cold War. Russia is trying to get back on its feet, and also I think it's quite important to remember that with Russia in control of its own armaments, which include the nuclear armaments, you have a Russia that is not going to occasionally just, what do we have here? A nuclear factory. Oops, sorry, we didn't look at it for 15 years and it just suddenly exploded. So you want to have Russia that is in control of its own stuff and heritage, which is quite a lot. And in that sense, I think it's better to have Russia that is safer and feels safe than to have Russia that is just letting the equipment slip into the terrorists' hands or things like that.
Do you think we've got away quite lightly? I mean, we're about a month away from the first part of the electoral cycle, and I was expecting much more chaos, disaster, wars, all sorts of levers being pulled by parts of the Russian elite for some crisis that would keep Putin in power or usher somebody else in or put Zhirinovsky in some more ridiculous position. Do you think we've actually got away quite lightly? All we've had is Russian Bear bombers flying slightly near Norway, the very unfortunate murder of somebody in London, and lots of strange things, but no enormous war, or they haven't invaded Chechnya again, or Georgia, or they haven't invaded Norway, which would be interesting.
No, I mean, it depends, of course, what your scale of reference is. It has to be said. But,
there's time, Nick.
No, and there is time. I mean, we haven't had the Duma elections, and we also haven't had the, at least formal presidential process. And I think, above all, we certainly haven't had the Putin model, which was the Yeltsin model before. I name my recommended preferred successor, and now, of course, you, the people, endorse it. So, there is time, and I think, there's quite a lot of low-level terrorist activity in the North Caucasus. There is scope for something to go a bit wrong. There is scope for something a bit destabilising. But thank heavens for now, compared to some previous campaigns, it's been calm.
Sure. So, Mary, would you see the next 2 months passing with a similar kind of pace of quiet, managed succession, or do you think there is sufficient disquiet within the Kremlin elite, well, the people around the Kremlin, the Cherkessovs or various fractures of the ex-KGB elite who now run the country, to genuinely do something to upset each other, or are they far too worried about losing money to rock the apple cart?
I think there's a lot of politicking going on at the moment that we don't see. I mean, you see little things come to the surface about splits in the KGB, splits, and there's the change of Prime Minister. All those things indicate that there's politicking going on in the corridors of the Kremlin. Whether it will actually go to extra political methods, whether you will start getting, the odd atrocity, the odd provocation, I really don't know. I mean, you hope not, because what you hope for is that you get a political process which, while not perfect, you get parliamentary elections and then you get presidential election, and they pass off as proper elections without these outside distractions. What I do think is, what I mean, both of us know, is that the Kremlin is watching the mood of the population incredibly closely. Just as much as any Western government, they're commissioning polls to try and find out what people are thinking. You know, there is a general view that Russian elections are complete charades, but you do get the sense that in the Kremlin they're worried that there may be an election result which isn't actually what they predicted, and that they want to keep tabs on public opinion.
So that the results actually match what people think, even though they're pre-detested before.
Well, I mean, I think that the last Duma elections, I mean, I don't think you can write off these elections. I think that they are a reasonably, you can have all sorts of objections about them, but they are a reasonably accurate reflection of the political breakdown in Russia.
Well, it's possible to think if you watch state TV for 4 years.
Yeah, but if you look at the composition of the parliament and of the Duma and the way it's broken down into the parties, I felt that 4 years ago that was a reasonable reflection of the way Russia thought.
We don't have to be too excited about how wonderful the Russian economy is doing, because with $89 a barrel, you can kind of expect them not to be doing too badly. But do you see what Mary was talking about as an inevitable consequence of this growing Russian middle class, who have money, who pay taxes, who have a sort of power that lets Echo Moscow stay on the air, that lets people still be able to go on holiday? There is an expanding economy there that actually the Kremlin are beginning to get increasingly scared of their population.
I'm not scared of the Kremlin, and I think... Sorry. Well, the thing is, I just feel that Russia, whether it's... it depends on the oil, or it could have been something else, or there would have been no oil. But Russia is slowly getting back on track. It's sorting out its internal problems. It's voicing out its preferences on the international arena, and it's heading in a certain direction. It's moving, and it's not moving downhill. I think it's actually moving uphill. What I do think is also that the current authorities are still, whether you want it or not, they're still the bearers of, they still have certain mentality remnants from the Soviet Union. These are people who grew up in certain circumstances, and there is a whole generation in Russia which you can't write off that also sort of still thinks along the same lines. And we are judging Russia today, but I think in a way we should look a little bit further into the future, because the future of Russia lies with next generations, with the people who have been traveling abroad, who have been studying abroad, once they got this access.
There's a tiny pocket of the population there, isn't it? That's
well,
less than the number of people who go to Eton, possibly, in Britain.
But
So, Andrew, yeah. Sorry, is that any better? Or, okay, let me do that. Okay. So, Andrew, sorry, just to go back to that, do you feel that you need like 20, 30 years of rehabilitation for the Soviet old elite to die and a new elite to come forward, or is that Soviet elite doing such a good job of reminding the younger generation how to behave that their legacy will live on?
Well, I think, clearly there is a rejuvenation, and that's to be welcome, and it's extraordinary, how many young people are, proving active in all sorts of aspects of Russian society. The sad thing is perhaps that, materialism and a sort of liberation perhaps from some of the constraints of all sorts from the past means that they're not terribly concerned about democratization on politics in general at the moment, it seems to me. But I think there's a broader concern, which is that while it's remarkable how quickly an older generation has rediscovered some of their Soviet reflexes. I'm talking about self-censorship in the media, for example, certain behaviors of public officials, prosecutors, judges in particular, and so on, have rediscovered those old roots. Russia, like a number of other countries that were, as it were, victorious, as it were, took charge of their own symbolic political change, i.e. the collapse of communism, hasn't really come to terms with the lessons of that past. And I think what's disturbing is there is now a younger generation. You know, if you look at the rewriting of Russian history books about the Soviet era, for example, if you look at what you see on Russian television, which is a glorification of the, you know, the achievements of what the Russians, of course, call the Great Patriotic War, and no doubt they were absolutely, you know, fundamental in winning what we would call the Second World War. But the fact is, it stresses the positive, it underplays the negative, it refuses to recognize the failures of what was a deeply evil and dysfunctional political system. And I think until there's a recognition of the problems of that, until one starts to see a museum of the Gulag that actually operates in Moscow, until one sees a more active debate again about those lessons from the past passed on to the younger generation, you know, we do risk kind of creating a resurgent oil-fueled nationalism and protectionism, which, you know, to some degree I think we bear a responsibility for, but above all is going to be a tragedy for Russia.
Darry, do you worry that that's actually something which could be seized upon by your generation? You could see there's never been really a reconciliation, a coming to terms with however many million people died throughout the communist era, and the communist era is seen as a previous time of success, despite the fact that it fell apart on its own accord. What do you feel your generation has inherited from it?
Well, I feel that once you've opened the borders, in a way, you can't go back. So the changes that have already happened, I know that for my teacher of history in 1992 or 94, it was a total, basically, restructuring of her brain, which was making her brain explode, going from one history to another history. But whereas those children who were already learning things, who got access to the books that were forbidden in the Soviet Union, who went, as I said, to study abroad, they learn different things and they have access to the sources. So no matter how glorifying, as you say, you are about, I think it's just another way of trying to reassure the Russians that they're not on the bottom of sort of just not in the bottom. That's not part, they shouldn't feel humiliated, which they did many times in, let's say, the 90s. So in that sense, I think it's part of the process of reassuring the Russians that we're a great nation and you have to believe in that. And if you look at how, again, President Putin has been talking today about the improvement of the demographic situation, when people don't believe in their own country, that they can do things, that they have the past that they can be proud of, they don't give birth to children. And if you look at the extreme, how far it can lead, it's actually the United States, the example of democracy, where the glorification of things, if you watch the movie which is called Pearl Harbor, you will think that the Great Patriotic War or the Second World War was won by the Americans, no?
Well, fair enough. We're going to take questions in a moment before you lynch us. I'd just like to ask everyone on the panel to sum up Putin in 2 words now. What do you think? What do you think you could best say about him right now? Andrew, I'm afraid you have to go first.
Well, I'm sorry, it's going to be slightly longer. And we're not even talking foreign policy here.
We're just talking him
the whole
now, right now, Putin. What about that? But now you've had slightly longer.
I think he was a man for his times who was the transitional figure, who brought the stability without which there couldn't be either material or democratic development.
Power of 17. Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to cut it down, Andrew.
Okay, so first term necessary, good. You know, second term declining, shall we say?
I would probably say still there. What about you, Darry?
I would say healthy, relatively reasonable reader.
Okay, fair enough. So let me invite you to paste us, please. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yes, of course.
I'm not interested in the big picture, but I was going to ask, in local democracy, like at the mayor level and downwards, in running the country, how far has Russia gone in democratization so that the country can be run more efficiently for the people?
Who are you asking that? Sorry.
Pardon?
To whom are you asking that?
To all of you who knows about it. I know nothing.
Mary, you know everything.
I think Dario would probably answer it better than I do. there was always a lot more democracy at the absolute grassroots base level than the sort of Communist Party diktat suggested, because the real elections took place before the election in terms of who was going to be the candidate, the single candidate, and it depends very much from place to place. I mean, my impression is that some places it is very democratic and very efficient. Some places it's reasonably efficient, largely because it's not democratic at all. And some places it's not at all democratic and not at all efficient. It's a very, very mixed picture, but I mean, Daria may know better.
Well, I actually think that if you talk about, as it is often being pointed out, Russia up to the Urals is the European part of Russia, is a very different thing from the rest of the Russian territory. So I actually think that people in some faraway towns may not even know what democracy really is. So when you ask them, do you feel you have democratic rights, they're going to stare at you and say, what are you talking about? So in that sense, there may be, as Mary has just said, less of democratic institutions, of more of democratic activities, but in this, I think that the institutions in Russia still have, democratic institutions still have a long way to go, and they still have to be built, and the country itself is not really fully and totally prepared to brace a totally new way of thinking and acting after hundreds of years of one ruler of the Tsar or the...
I had a question where I watched Russia Today, and when you had that fire in the elderly people's home, the chief fire officer was questioned, and he was waiting answers from Putin for solving the problem, and yet a problem like that in the West is solved locally. So in that respect,
in that sense, it is also an acknowledged fact that some governors of the areas are more efficient, some are less efficient. There are areas where you can actually be more efficient because, you know, like some areas have oil, some areas have some warmth, whereas in other areas, you know, you have nothing but the frost and the forests. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of problems with the corruption, with the inefficient local governors, and the central power still hasn't got to dealing with that. It's still sort of...
Andrew, do you think if people in Moscow talk about knowing what their democratic rights are, they have a clue what they're talking about, or this is a Russian notion of democracy which doesn't really bear any relation to what we would regard?
Well, I think it's different, and I think it's right that it's different. You know, I do think overall that, you know, Putin is democratically elected, whether people are like to accept that or not. You know, at the regional, the local level, it's, you know, not very democratic, and it's not very efficient, I would say, on the whole. But, you know, because one can argue Ken Livingstone's probably democratically elected, but is London efficiently run? You know, everything on its own scale. I do think there is an issue of centralisation of power. You know, whether the fire chief can really, you know, blame the fact that he was supposedly waiting for Putin, you know, seems to be a pretty big excuse as well. Although it does say there's something dysfunctional within the local hierarchy.
Another question, please.
Andrew, for you, how realistic is it that Putin might really be a controlling factor in the next presidency? He's saying he's going to, anyone taking that role is going to have some reckoning to do with him. And how strong or how weak is he seen in terms of the warring factions within the Kremlin? And thirdly, how realistic might it be that he would ever return to presidential power at some later date?
So, and the first bit was
retain power.
How realistic would
the first bit? The first bit,
yeah.
Yeah.
How realistic?
Yeah.
He's saying that anyone's going to have to reckon with him in the next presidential role. Just how realistic is that?
I think it's very realistic at first if he can find the right candidate, but I think precisely the problem is he is flailing. You know, either you pick someone who starts to become themselves prominent, if only because of the symbolism of the office with the current constitution and the degree of media coverage they get and so on, which was really Putin's key to success from someone who wasn't known to anybody only a decade ago. So I think the chances are, at least in the initial period, he will pull a lot of strings. But, you know, the fact is, I think, as with the Putin system today, which is to say, as Mary was saying, you know, if he really wants to decide something, it'll happen. But, you know, nobody can govern everything in any country, and certainly not in one as complex and opaque and tribal, if I can put it that way, as Russia. So, you know, I would be very surprised if, let's say, if the game plan is in 4 years after 2008, he wants to come back to being president. I'm not sure it's going to work, in just the same way as with Yeltsin, you know, who many people thought was still pulling the strings behind Putin. You know, has any chance of, well, had rest his soul now, but, you know, had any chance of coming back?
I think it's a very valid point that you have to remember that Russia is not predictable in many ways. And one of those things is that if we have a supposedly successor, as Putin was to Yeltsin, and he turned out to be such a different thing from Yeltsin, you never know what the next president, who would be supposedly Putin's figure, turned out to be.
Mary?
I have nothing to add to that.
There you go. One more question, please. Oliver. Sorry. An old colleague from Moscow who knows more about this than we do.
Question from Mr. Justin. I'm interested by your description of Putin as a transitional figure who was necessary for democratic development. Eight years ago, Russia had an independent television station and had judges who occasionally did their own thing. They had prosecutors that did their own thing. They had democratically elected regional governors. Do you really think it's more democratic now than it was 8 years ago?
It's very easy to say no. I would say that the amount of democracy that existed when Putin took over was less democracy than it was a degree of chaos. Now, you can say that chaos allows a degree of democracy, or I mean, I'm not sure that we're talking actually about democracy, talking about free speech. That doesn't exist now. I would put against that you can't actually have systematic and protected free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and all the rights that people expect, unless you have a stable political situation, one, that you have a reasonable level of well-being, both of which are sort of predictability and stability that Putin has brought, which Yeltsin left the country completely without, and that to suggest that that closing down independent television stations is tantamount to halting democracy and free speech is actually wrong, because the justification, insofar as there's justification for it, is that if television stations or any other media can operate, can survive financially, then that's fine. The rationale for shutting down the television stations was that they couldn't, and they were taking state subsidies effectively to operate as a state-funded oppositions, and that's the rationale for it. So, you know, I understand what you're saying, and I probably agree about 30%, but I don't agree 100%. And I think that whoever takes over now has a much sort of healthier society from which to start up things like for independent television stations, if we take that as a standard, independent radio stations, that there is now a basis for that to be enshrined in law, which wasn't there before. When you talk about the courts, I'm not sure that I agree, because there's been an awful lot of legislation, court reform, judicial reform that's been going through. I don't actually accept that the courts, nationally or locally, are more corrupt than or more beholden to the regime than they were when Putin took over. I think, again, it's a very mixed picture, transitional picture.
I'd just say if Mary's at 30%, I'll be at 70%, in the sense that, you know, clearly there wasn't, you know, independent media, there wasn't entire free speech, but what there was diversity of ownership. So at least you had competing interests with competing views, putting forward a variety of ideas. And in the same way, you know, we certainly didn't have perfect democracy by any means in the 1990s, but again, there was an idea of political competition, and that's the tragedy, I think, of the last 8 years, that that's reduced.
Dara, do you see that there's been obviously a clear cost in that there is no such thing really, apart from Echo Moscow and maybe some fringe newspapers who are oppositional in their notion. There isn't much of a, as Andrew says, debate or competition or real independence in the Russian media now. Is that an acceptable price you would see for some of the economic success and the stability that's come about?
I just think that sometimes, you know, in order to jump across an abyss, you have to take a couple of steps back so that you can run and make the breakthrough. So if what is happening in Russia is seen as going back, it may be seen that way, but I don't think it's actually going back because, again, once you've given people the freedom of speech, the rights to do things, you can't stop it. And even if we talk about the Chinese scenario where the internet is controlled, this is not the case in Russia. There are still different views that are being expressed. Nobody's going to put you into prison if you go and talk to people. And we, the interesting thing is that even the Echo of Moscow, the liberal radio station that you've mentioned, they're saying, you know, our audience now sees the United States as an opponent. We feel that even those people who used to be defending the democratic rights and everything, they now are talking still with turning it towards the angle of national interests. It's not totally you tell us what we do it. It's more like, okay, well, now let's stop and think, what do we actually want to do? So in that sense, as Andrew has been saying, there is a scary thing of self-censorship among the journalists. I think it's not that scary because when a journalist, before actually shouting on the, you know, front pages of the newspapers about how appalling things are, stops and thinks what reaction it may cause and whether it's for the good or for the bad, that's not a bad thing.
You brought it up, self-censorship. You work for a station which is heavily funded by the Kremlin. What goes through your mind when you see something happen in Russia? Do you think, oh, that's obviously the story everyone wants to hear, or you think this is the story that we have to tell people in order to keep our jobs?
You see, I'm lucky. I'm in London.
Yeah.
So, no, I can tell you I've never once been called by my editor-in-chief.
That's why self-censorship works, because they don't have to call you, you do it for them.
Have I been saying things which are
no, I think it's
making you think that I'm being censored? No, I really feel that what I'm saying is what I believe. So in that sense, I do not contradict myself. I do believe that a certain amount of self-censorship should every journalist should actually have within themselves. And if you're, it's like with the BBC.
Professional discipline versus self-censorship.
No. At some stage, the TV station decided that they will not be broadcasting the images that are going to be disturbing, and there is no open wounds, blood, or cut bodies into pieces on television. That is self-censorship.
There is on Russian television, though, I must add.
There was more.
Can we have another question, please? Sorry. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I just have a couple of quick questions for Daria.
You can have one to start.
We haven't really discussed the impunity regarding the killings of journalists in Russia. We've heard about Anna Politkovskaya's case, but we know that, I mean, the statistics actually would say probably since Putin came to power, at least 40 journalists have been killed. Their murders are unresolved. There's very little solidarity with the media community as to why this happened. I would just wonder, first of all, what your position is about why this has happened and why there's very little reporting about these issues in the Russian media. And I guess my second question would relate to the fact that, you know, also it's very difficult to report on some issues right now in the Russian media. Some statistics say that 90% of the sources come from the government now, if you look at the first three channels in the Russian and the national level. So
Dara, when you see
the issue of impunity regarding killings of journalists versus coverage, is there somehow a correlation between these issues?
I think obviously any killings of journalists or any killings are a scary thing. And the question that I would like to throw back at you: do you know who Dmitry Holodov was? good, because most people probably wouldn't know. They would know the name of Anna Politkovskaya, but they would barely know the name of Dmitry Holodov. This was a journalist who was killed in the mid-90s in the center of Moscow in his office because he was investigating corruption issues. And there was very, very little coverage of that fact in the West, because at those times you had President Yeltsin in power. He was a democratizer of Russia. 2.5 times more journalists were killed from 1992 to the time when Putin came to power. This fact nobody's talking about. Everybody says a hell of a lot of journalists are dying in Putin's times. I think the more stability there is in the country, the fewer killings of journalists there are, whether you want it or not. The death of Anna, again, she was obviously a brave and courageous journalist who did what she believed in, but she also knew, when I met her, I had a feeling she knew she was, you know, on a dangerous path, because she was not only criticizing, as it is being only said, the most vocal critic of Putin. Not only, she was investigating, she was involved in so many stories that involved the Chechen mafia, different circles which could have been involved. So I'm not pointing the fingers, but I'm just saying that with people like Anna, who are dealing in, who are reporting about such a region as Chechnya, obviously there is a lot of dangers, and probably any journalist who is going along the line of investigative journalism is putting himself or herself under a certain amount of danger that could happen to them. Or, sorry, what was the second question?
All right, and we can hear you. So.
All the government information from the government.
The second question is related to the fact that there's been analysis done about Russian, the 3 national channels, their news coverage.
Oh, right, the
90%
sources,
of
the state sources
come from the government. So my question correlated to the first is that, is this because the government controls the stations? Is this related to somehow the fact that, you know, that there is this self-censorship in Russia? But the reality is, if you look at statistically the news coverage in Russia, 90% of coverage on the 3 national stations is from government sources. So somehow, are the Russian citizens getting actually objective information about what's going on in their country?
I actually find it quite interesting, because in the 90s, and even when I was starting to work for the BBC, the officials were so scared of the journalists that there were no government sources at all. They just wouldn't talk to the press. So in that sense, there is probably more information that is coming from the official sources. Whether it's a good or bad thing, it's for the people to decide. But if you say that the United States don't manage their press, don't talk to their press, and don't tell their press what they would like to hear, that would probably be slightly underestimating the U.S. administration. So
it's a very common defence, though, in Russia, isn't it? Saying it's okay for us to do it because Fox News get rung up by the White House, so that makes everything we do wrong okay. Interesting to see you repeat it. But.
Okay, let's take Britain.
Yeah.
What do you tell me about Britain? You mean Tony Blair hasn't been spinning the media? And
Absolutely, yeah. But our choice is to resist it or accept it. And he gets out of power because we resist it for 2 years. It takes 2 years, but still.
Okay, I probably won't talk for Russia because I've been out of Russia for 2 years, so I haven't really followed the channels in Moscow or in Russia. But I can tell you about Russia today that when I provide a report, I'm always told, if you're giving one side, give another side. So we are trying to keep it balanced. And in that sense, if you're, it's just a normal practice in journalism, and I don't feel that we're totally imbalanced because we're state-funded. We are actually quite free to do what we're looking for. And sometimes maybe it would be better if there was more of an official line, because it feels like, you know, so what do we feel like today?
Dizzying. More questions, please. Yeah.
In his Послание last year, Putin made a quote which was from an old Soviet joke, "Comrade Wolf knows whom to eat." The corollary of that is that Comrade Wolf also knows whom not to eat. Now, all this talk of a new Cold War, in my view, is actually just Russia reestablishing its position in the world, and that a lot of it actually works both ways. It's good for Russian internal PR, and also it's good for the West to show, oh gosh, look, we need to have more defence spending. the question is, if Comrade Wolf knows whom not to eat, then in terms of Russia's future position, what should it do in terms of pushing? How far should it push? Because I've seen Vladimir Putin and Tony Blair in the same room, and Tony Blair was scared stiff of him.
Okay. Who's that question to? Sorry. Daria, there you go, please. What should Vladimir Putin do?
I'm sorry, I missed.
Responsible foreign policy.
Mary, please, come on.
Well, there's a lot of things that Russia, and not only Putin, can do in improving their PR. I mean, one of they're just the most clumsy presenters of their own cause imaginable. I mean, the turning off the Ukrainian gas was an absolute classic. Where it gave absolutely the worst impression. It confirmed all the stereotypes. When you looked at the small print of all this, actually the law was on Russia's side, and even Yulia Tymoshenko in Ukraine, who would be the most anti-Russian, most free marketeer, most anti anything to do with the old Soviet Union and Gazprom. Even she, when I asked her a few months afterwards why they hadn't gone to court, taken it to international arbitration, made it quite clear that she thought they would lose. And what's interesting this year is that Gazprom and the Russians have actually started getting out their case rather earlier. I've started getting emails from them which say we're putting out a warning to Ukraine because they're X amount in arrears, and then they sent out another one saying they've paid up their arrears, there will be no turn-off of the gas. But that was a classic example of how bad the Russians are at actually putting their own case internationally.
And they have spent millions and millions of dollars on PR. You were there for the G8. There were thousands of people running around, didn't quite know what they were doing. Used to work for Tony Blair, of all people.
Absolutely.
Do you think
even the BBC?
Well, absolutely. Do you think that they've just got more reassertive, and the extension of that is they've become clumsier in the message they give out, or do you think there's a genuine desire to try and integrate with the West? Are they actually trying to be nice, or are they just trying to send sharper signals?
I think there's less of a desire to integrate and more of a desire to articulate. And I think Mary's right. You know, they do need to do a lot more to communicate that. But you know, if you're asking in a more positive sense what they should do, I mean, I think there is an important role for Russia. You know, as if I could put it like as a sort of honest broker or a different, you know, a balancing power. If you look at the Middle East, for example, you know, it clearly does need some people with a slightly different perspective from those tarnished with, you know, the US and British attempts, shall we say, that have been rather one-sided there, for example. You know, I think if you look at Syria, if you look at Iran, there are a number of countries where the rhetoric from certain parts of the West has become so intense and aggressive that there is need for a different sort of entree into that area. North Korea, you could argue the same to some degree. I think the problem is, there, you know, if we talk about the Cold War, we're not talking about a new Cold War, but I think there is a residual element of Cold War thinking in Russia, which is zero-sum game. You know, basically, if it benefits them, it's bad for us. You know, if they want something, we have to have something too. And I think there are blockages where there could be, you know, more constructive engagement over Kosovo, over Iran and elsewhere, where unfortunately, you know, as it were, the hardliners, the hawks, have come to dominate too far in Russia at the moment, and we may just have to be a little bit patient and hope that that rebalances over time.
So you're with us or you're against us. The question at the back, please.
Well, I think what the last speaker had to say was good, but could be reinforced 1,000 times. I mean, a huge empire was dismantled almost overnight. So many of the republics disappeared. And I find it amazing, as an American, that, you know, we know what's happened in Chechnya and some of the Ossetia, some of the tension with Ukraine. Why hasn't a resurgent Russia tried to get back Ukraine, Turkestan, Kazakhstan? I think it's amazing how quiescent they've been. If the U.S. were exporting oil to Mexico rather than the other way around, you think we would wait for 1 second before cutting off the oil or gas if the Mexicans, you know, dared to pop up and say, you know, hello?
Can we have a question or something?
You see, I'm not the only one who's referring to...
Why are the expectations of good behavior from Russia so high in this room, considering the humiliation that Russia has suffered, Russia, successor of the Soviet Union, in the years since 91, partly at the hands of all our experts. Aren't you amazed that there hasn't been more savagery on the borders and more attempts to use whatever natural resources they have to manipulate policy in Europe?
So have you got off lightly, Darren?
I feel that's a massive sport. And at least I'm not the only one who's referring to the United States. But yes, I do feel when I go out there in the world that there are a lot of questions about Russia that are being raised that totally lack understanding of what is going on. And I do agree that this sort of transition period and this sort of the depth of the change that we're undergoing should be taken into account.
Are the expectations high because they're trying to regard themselves as an equivalent power to the G7, for example? Isn't that why their high expectations exist?
High expectations on
Russia, of how Russia should comport itself?
Well, I mean, there's the frequently cited that the Russians are being held, for instance, to higher standards than, say, China on free speech and civil rights, because Russia has signed up to the Council of Europe requirements, which China hasn't done, that Russia is basically a European power, aspires to be a European power, and if that's so, then it ought to comply with European expectations. I think that when Russia signed up to those requirements was in '93, when Russia was extremely weak. And I think expectations are rather overblown, that there's need for rather more patience about how long it's going to take Russia to meet those requirements. But I would say on your actual point about sort of Russia's borders, and I mean, I tend to, I have a lot of sympathy with what you say, because I think it is completely remarkable that what we saw was the collapse and the dismantling of the Soviet Union without civil war, without starvation, without refugees, which was what the West was. You know, I was in Moscow then, and I remember, I mean, the Western preparations for waves of refugees over the Finnish border were extraordinarily elaborate. I mean, that was among the expectations. Civil war was another. Those didn't happen. Chechnya has been extremely nasty, but it's not wholesale civil war in Russia. And I tend to think that what's been going on under Putin has been a very systematic attempt to reconcile Russians with the idea of being Russians in a smaller nation state, and that a lot of the diplomacy has been about going systematically around the new borders, establishing bilateral treaties, and actually in some cases with China, actually drawing the border. Which hadn't been agreed before, and drawing the borders with places like Kazakhstan that formerly were part of the Soviet Union, where it was really not that important where the border ran. And that there has been a systematic effort to do that, and I tend to think this has been an extraordinarily peaceful dismantling of an empire in very short time.
I actually have a slight objection on the word aspiring, because sometimes Russia doesn't even, you know, there are reports, Russia has been eager to enter the WTO since. It's not always that eager as it is being presented, and it is not always saying, oh, we should be part of every single organization worldwide because we're so big and wonderful. But what it is a two-way movement, because the West and the Western countries, and well, as well as the Eastern countries, realize that Russia, whether you want it or not, geopolitically, energetically, and all those issues, why it is important, it cannot be simply wiped out of the map and dealt with as with some tiny state. So it is being incorporated into the world affairs, and but it's not only on its own account. It's we're not talking about Russia, who claims it's the great power and you have to acknowledge it. It's also the other powers that realize, well, what do we want? We'd rather have Russia on our side because we have such issues as Iran. We have issues that we can't deal with without Russia.
I was going to say two things. The question was why are expectations so high, and I think it's partly because there was that period, particularly in the early 90s, of gross simplification and excessive optimism and an expectation that suddenly Russia would become Western. So it's inevitable that kind of we have to be let down from that. I agree with Mary absolutely that it's remarkable how peaceful the transition was, largely because it was imposed on Russia in a sense by a drunken president, rather than particularly the collapse of the handing away of the old Soviet republics, rather than through any democratic process. But the biggest victim has been the Russian people, not in terms of bloodshed directly, but if you look at life expectancy today, if you look at alcoholism, if you look at mental illness and so on, that's been a huge internalized and silent tragedy, and that's I think the biggest challenge where I would have liked to see Putin do more, and I hope that his successor will.
Please, long-awaited question.
It sounds to me, I know...
Down a second.
Sorry. I know another country very well, and that's Turkey, and this, practically every point of what you say immediately rings a bell in Turkey. I mean, it's taken Turkey, I don't know, estimates vary, but if it could, 80 years or 70 years to reach democracy, I mean... But the thing is, I've lived in Turkey for a long time, and I wonder how you, and I'm married to a journalist who's not Turkish, how long you as, I mean, for you, people who have lived there, when one's outside, one paints a very rosy picture. One's so much at pains to try and explain to people outside with all the bad media there is, that despite people like you reporting, it would be naive to ask why this happens, but it does happen. And yet when you're in the country, I know certainly in our case, and probably in your case, one's extremely critical. This is an uneasy situation, and a sort of disjuncture somewhere, and I wonder what you feel about this and how you can sort of, bring these two sides of oneself when talking about a country sort of into balance more.
But you mean the reporting we give is much more critical than the actual opinion?
No,
we
I
have
mean when one's in the country, one's writing in the country, one's talking, one's going to meetings, one's speaking out on panels very critically. Certainly, in fact, you're probably doing the same in Russia if there's such a forum. And when you're in a forum like this, you're absolutely at pains to try and present a more balanced picture, because you expect that most people have a very unbalanced picture because they're reading the media here.
I mean, the role of the journalist is to find the problem in the story and to pick away at the chink in the armour and expose that to people.
On both sides, and it's, is there anything you can say about this?
But that's a fault.
Not necessarily, no. You wouldn't read anything that said, this happened today, 200 people died, but it's okay because the rest of the country was all right. I mean, it would seem absurd in its own way.
Believe me, you get an...
Those two, he was
I know very well. It's an unbalanced... You get an unbalanced picture.
And you feel uneasy. No, you feel uneasy yourself.
You do find yourself defending a country.
Exactly.
It's
better than me.
In a way that you wouldn't do it when you were living there. Best critics.
You're critical when you're inside the country.
Absolutely.
No, I think it's a constant dilemma. No, I would agree. No, I mean, you just have to kind of be sensitive to your audience, and you want to try and balance the perception that's out there. I think you're trying to provide objective information, but you also have to interpret and explain it in a way that balances prejudices and ignorances. Yeah, but it's true. I mean, I think on the whole, I would certainly feel I was more critical internally and speaking to Russians than I would be talking to people who have less experience or from outside Russia.
I think it's very important not to think about it at all. I think each incident is its own entire, absolutely separate instance, and you report that as faithfully as you can, and the qualification you need to make sense to people. I don't think it really is helpful to try and think about a broader picture you're painting when you're reporting something that happened that particular day. Something like Beslan, you can't say, well, there's a terrible thing happened here today, but bearing in mind the rest of Russia lived peacefully. You have to concentrate on the event.
It's different, but if you're talking more general picture of the...
I'd just like to add something there. As it happened, I was in Turkey about 10 days ago, and I feel that the internal mood is slightly different, and at least in the less this time, in fact, but the last few years that I've been to Russia, I found that I was almost having to sort of defend Russia to Russians. There was a huge sort of there was a sense of depression among a lot of people that things were going backwards, that the economy wasn't, even though the economy was booming externally, that the fruits of this weren't being seen sufficiently in Russia, that it was all awful and dreadful and terrible. And I was there saying, look here, look, it's only been 15 years, it's not so bad, you haven't been to war, you know, you've now got your own flat, you're not sharing a flat. All these things have happened, and you know, you don't have to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and stand in a queue for chickens that don't exist. And people sort of said, well, yes, I suppose that's true. So, you know, I was telling people, you know, just don't go sort of shoot yourself tomorrow because it's really not so bad. So I haven't actually found that sort of, that divergence.
Thank you for that. Can we question over there, please?
First of all, I have a question for Andrew Jack. You said earlier on that the materialism among young elements of the political opposition will suppress any bottom-up activity.
Will suppress any
bottom-up activity or in the future. But if you read the reports in Kommersant and Russian news sources about the rise of commodity prices and unaffordable healthcare and things like this, there is a sense of an economic crisis, which people like Ryzhkov are using as a political campaign. So how do you see this in the future? How do you see it playing out? Is it just part of a campaign, or is it something that the opposition could use?
the rise of commodity prices and the tensions that's creating?
Well, it's kind of a sense of economic crisis. And then I also have a question for Daria, about blogging. The blogging statistics of blogging in Russia are staggering, and there's a lot been made about it being some kind of platform for the opposition. And I wanted to ask you, I know the evidence at the moment is just anecdotal, but perhaps you have an opinion on how that could play out in the future as well.
Should we do blogging first, very quickly?
Well, I think that's one of the probably places where you can find the whole variety of opinions in all its forms and shapes, and I don't think it's going to go away, and the government is going to go as far as to control the internet space. So whoever wants to find the reviews could just go there.
So you're going to get revolution from high food prices, the rest of the world priced out from the oil boom.
I mean, I think the macro picture in Russia looks very promising. A lot of it, of course, is driven by oil, but it's not just that. There is a kind of, a resurgence more generally. There is a trickle-down. I think what's striking about Russia is the growing inequality and the speed of growth of that inequality, if I can put it. And I think that does create scope, unless there are more responsible social policies. In terms of the political interaction, I remember 2003, I guess it was. I mean, one of the most striking examples of how that can be an explosion point is when the government tried to reform the social housing system, and you had this spectacle of, aging Russians out on the street demonstrating, and the image of Russia as a powerful top-down system that could impose its will for reform was exposed as entirely hollow, because a few pensioners on the street and the government slammed into reverse, and that was the beginning of the end of Putin's economic reform plans, actually. So yes, I mean, there are sparks. I'm not sure opposition figures like Ryzhkov or others can fully exploit them, but it's definitely something that will have to be addressed.
You've been making for hours.
I'm Robert Elphick. I was in Moscow during the real Cold War, and I remember very well that I've been trying to make sense of the Soviet Union, of its Russia, for the past 50 years. And I remember very much one point when they had overflights. We had flights going towards the Russian borders, and they had flights coming our way. One airplane crashed on the border somewhere near Turkey, just inside NATO territory, and Khrushchev, I was in the Kremlin that evening, and Khrushchev sounded off, this is before the U-2, Khrushchev sounded off at great length about how awful this was, and to the group of ambassadors and me around him, he was saying, I don't know how you can sleep safely in your beds with this going on, you see, and our ambassador, unfortunately, said to him, we can sleep safely in our beds because we know that nobody is going to attack the Soviet Union. Now that is a lesson which I think diplomats ought to keep on telling the Russians now to this day. We are not ever going to attack Russia. That is a given fact. Now to come back to Putin in the present day, if I were Russian, I'd probably be voting for Putin at the moment. But that's my personal view. But I'd like to know, we knew what Khrushchev's constituency was. He had 18 million communists at his command, more or less, until he got shut down. But what is Putin's constituency? Is it the KGB? I read the other day that there's a terrible infight inside the KGB. Is it true? What is going on? And who is going to come out on top? Is Putin going to put his own house in order to bring out these reforms we've been talking about.
So, who is Putin's constituency?
Oh, you should ask Putin. I think if I knew for sure, I wouldn't be sitting here. But there is a feeling that Putin has got his own sort of circle of close people, just maybe like any other political leader, and that he is very much a man of personal trust rather than on who is being advised to him or suggested as coming from the outside. He relies on people who have always been there. Whether those people are always KGB people, I wouldn't really take.
So, Mary, do you think there is a clear fracture beginning between people of the KGB, or is that being manufactured to give another excuse to stay on for as long as he needs?
I don't know. I mean, I distrust Kremlinology now just as I distrusted it when I was doing it. So I don't know. I mean, I think what Dario was talking about really was Putin's power base. If you look at his sort of popular constituency, then I think you can probably say that it's the current centre of Russian politics. That he's been quite clever in trimming his policies and his statements to suit sort of middle Russia, people who have ambitions but not too great ambitions, people who are not rich but who've seen their fortunes rise in recent years, people who are on the verge of buying their first flats, people who are having their first children because they see a hope of improvements in living standards, people who think that Putin shows a strong face to abroad but has upheld Russian dignity, unlike Yeltsin. All those things, but there are people around the fringes, the people who would say that Putin doesn't reform enough, that he hasn't given enough ordinary people opportunities to take to make money, that or people at the other end of the spectrum who say that he's been far too unegalitarian and he's been too friendly with the West and he should have been even more hawkish. So I think he's been quite politically sensitive to where the centre of Russian politics is throughout his 8 years.
Andrew?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think who's the inner circle? There's no doubt a small group. He's himself talked about Ivanov, the former defence minister, long-standing KGB compatriot, Patrushev, the head of the FSB. I know everyone's talking about the KGB, by the way, because it's nominally not the KGB anymore. But, I'm not sure, he really trusts anybody, frankly, that far, as I think the kind of machinations around the successor to some degree demonstrate. But I think Mary's right, in terms of the popular support, it's very large. As I said, I think he is democratically very popular. One of his greatest achievements, in my view, was that he was able to reach out and to consolidate the society after the huge ruptures of the 1990s, to pensioners, to war veterans, as well as to the younger generations as well. The only concern is, I think, it's a support that's very broad, but arguably relatively shallow. It's driven, to a large degree by the oil reserves that have helped fuel economic resurgence, by words and by his very high profile in the media. And the risk is, both of those factors could pop.
There is a complete absence of competition, though, isn't there? I mean, you cannot think of anybody apart from people Putin has put up himself who could ever succeed him.
Absolutely, absolutely. Although we look at Yeltsin in '99, he'd gone through so many prime ministers in the previous 2 years. One can imagine who on earth would replace him.
Can we have another question, please?
Yes.
Okay. Pavel, please.
Andrew, first I would say that I'm a Russian journalist, and I don't think the Cold War II is coming.
Good. I agree. Did I say that?
I didn't say
that. I would disagree with you, Andrew, that Russians are still up for a zero-sum game. And there was actually something Putin got from the Americans was the Texan hat.
Exactly.
But we've been discussing media quite a lot, and everybody on the panel agrees, more or less, that it's the headlines of the newspapers in the West which are inflammatory of this slogan, back to the Cold War. It's appreciated fact that for the past several years, Moscow hasn't been the sort of top posting for foreign journalists. Do you feel, as a former Moscow correspondent, that the quality of Moscow-based correspondents have jobbed down. And do you...
Since when? Since you left.
Exactly. Well, particularly to you, Nick, after your fantastic last piece, how you have become Vlad's fan. Do you think is it kind of a common sort of process of all Moscow-based correspondents that in the beginning, for instance, they don't have sources or they don't have understanding, they're too based on the stereotypes, and at the end they are likely to produce more quality analysis of what's going on in Russia?
I think seeing people who first arrive, their first instinct is always to take the easiest shots, and you see correspondents who are new and they'll say things like, it's almost like Stalin's Russia, which is of course completely ridiculous. People aren't being shot in the woods on a regular basis, or we don't know about it anyway if they are. But I think as people's information grows and they understand slightly more, they realise that what they originally thought is sort of true, except that the reasons for it are slightly more complicated, and you begin to understand that it's not necessarily pathological behaviour on the part of the Kremlin. It's a mixture of stupidity, it's a mixture of chaos, it's a mixture of good intentions, bad results sometimes, and a lot of the time it's just short-sighted. And I think the more you understand that, the more you begin to feel that the rhetoric you may first have when you get there, you may listen less to Ryzhkov, you may listen less to some of the opposition. I'm sure you don't ever listen to Limonov, but...
and then your editors decide to replace you.
No, not at all, actually. And then your editors ring up and start going, oh, he's really been there far too long. He begins to think it's all okay what's going on there. And the last piece I wrote was saying that everything Vladimir Putin has done has not been absolutely awful, because that seems to be, a lot of the time, the scale of the coverage you get is critical, because a lot of things going on there are bad, and as journalists you'll write about that, not about how bread prices have remained even in January. And you do find yourself having to at some point explain, actually, having lived the last years, a lot of people we know have actually had very nice jobs and are doing very well, and there's not constant chaos, and actually suicide bombing on the metro is not as much of a threat as it used to be, and there has been some amelioration at the cost of pretty much all independent media, at the cost of anything resembling democracy. But once you've kind of got over that slight unpleasant aftertaste, you can come to terms with the fact that there is something going on in Russia that is an improvement of what was there in the 90s. And I don't think it's ever possible really to say anything like that about Russia without immediately wanting to say afterwards, but of course it's terrible, I don't think it's fine. Because the nature of it is always going to be ridiculous extremes. The good stuff, the economic revival, the middle class growing, comes at enormous poverty, no political freedom, ridiculous foreign policy rhetoric that occasionally makes your spine shudder. But there is something good happening at the same time as something bad is happening. I'm sure that was the same in 1988.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to answer in two ways, really. As to whether it's sort of better, worse.
That's it.
That's it. Democracy.
It's Robert Davis's food poisoning. As to whether it's better, worse, or the same, I think that the journalists who go to Moscow now, there is less cachet about being posted to Moscow than there was then. It was certainly when I was posted there. The other thing to say is that I don't think the coverage is necessarily worse in the standard of reporting. In some ways it's probably more professional, because it's sort of genuine journalists who get sent to Moscow rather than Russian specialists anymore. But the problem is that you lose something by that as well, because you lose the context, you lose the historical context, you may lose the language skills, and so you get a different sort, maybe more professional, but less in some ways sort of sensitive and in-depth. Also, I think one of the reasons why I feel that the coverage is so unsatisfactory is because editors basically aren't interested in it anymore. I mean, the more stable and boring Russia is, the less stories you can get into the paper. And the sort of the big economic political story about Russia becoming richer and more influential again has hardly been covered over the last sort of 5 years.
Andrew, were you amazed to see Putin's deciding to be Prime Minister, well, saying he might like it if that was okay? were surprised to not see that on the front pages?
Well, I would go back to the earlier point. I mean, I recall when I went in '98. You know, one of the correspondents for the British paper said to me, you know, this has become a real FT story. It's now going to be all boring. It's all going to be about writing about pensions and economic reform, and everything's fabulous. You know, forget about the politics and all the rest of it. So, you know, all that to say, it's unpredictable. I mean, I saw, you know, journalists and incidentally also diplomats and expats and all sorts of others who would start positive on Russia and become negative, but I also saw the reverse, and I think, you know, that's partly about subjective factors of the people, and it's also about relatively short periods very often that they stay in Russia, but it's also about objective changes in the environment. You know, you could say there were periods when they were worse and there were periods when things got better. I don't think we speak about quality, but I mean there is an issue about quantity, certainly. I mean, again, you know, what's striking is Moscow in the late 80s, early 90s was an extraordinary place, and there were vast numbers of foreign journalists and big teams. And I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, what I saw was all of those. You know, I mean, the LA Times had 4 correspondents, a whole bunch of interpreters, fixers, photographers, stringers, you name it. You know, now they've got 2, I think. The same in the New York Times, the Washington Post. And half the time when I was there, even those correspondents were off in Afghanistan, Iraq, or whatever. So the depth of coverage, you know, certainly the quantity, the sheer volume has definitely declined.
A definite financial decision, basically.
There's even a couple of American TV stations who no longer base there, right?
Absolutely. It's now a secondary story. The story now is in the Middle East and in Washington, and you're more likely possibly to base your big fireman for the rest of the world in Berlin than you are in Moscow.
Probably good for us after all.
Yes, Leon, please.
When I was in the 58 to 62, I was there actually. I wasn't allowed back because the KGB put the kibosh on me for some reason. I don't know why. But the fact was that all of us, every correspondent I've known who's come out of Russia after any time, has come out with a great admiration for the Russians, extraordinary Russians, and a great contempt for the regime. And I think probably that hasn't changed.
No, that's pretty fair. Sorry, we have one last question over here, and then I'm sure you'll want to...
This is for everyone, it's a very short question. But when I was speaking to Russian journalists earlier this year, especially from Novaya Gazeta, they all, well, from Novaya Gazeta to and Komsomolskaya Pravda, they say that there are regular meetings at the Kremlin with senior members of the press and Kremlin officials, not in a sense dictating what should be the coverage, but subversively so. Could you respond?
Well, I think everyone knows that happens, and I think if it happened in Downing Street, we call it a briefing, and if it happened in White House, we call it the press gaggle, and it happens in the Kremlin, of course. By the nature of the way the media functions in Russia, it's going to come with a much more sinister overtone. And, yeah, I mean, that's how self-censorship works. And there are elements of the American press corps, I'm sure, who don't write certain things that may upset people. The American press corps was fairly on side about Iraq until about a year ago. January this year, they all decided it was a bad idea. They started calling it civil war. And that was universal, and it happened in about a week. But I don't know what you think, Daria, about that.
Well, I actually agree with you on that point, so I wouldn't be adding anything, but I wanted to add one point to the fact about the coverage, for example, in the British media. When I only came to the UK about a couple of years ago, one of the experts told me, you have to understand, British media is very, very... I wouldn't use the words that Tony Blair used, sort of feral beasts, but they're very, very much after negative news, and they like those stories, and that's what makes the front pages here in Britain. So the British media is very, very harsh. That's not why maybe we see so few good stories out of Russia, and that's why maybe the Russians don't feel that bad about reporting some good stuff after 10 years of reporting about chaos and poverty and about...
Do you not worry sometimes that the amount of positivity coming out ignores a whole load of things that could have been swept up very easily had they just had the option of publicity on them for 5 minutes?
Well, you know what? I watch our channel and I see stories about AIDS, I see stories about poverty, I see stories about pensions.
Your channel's in English and isn't seen in Russia, so it's not...
It is seen in Russia.
Not by that many Russians.
Okay.
Unless they speak English, in which case they watch CNN, probably. I mean, if it was in Russian, I'd understand you, but there is a point that a lot of the television coverage you see in Russia is enormously positive. What do you think, Mary? Do you think it's unfair to say that Russian television is, at the moment, a whitewash of
No, I mean, Russian national television, which reaches all part of the Soviet Union, First Channel is, I mean, it's not back to the Soviet era. There are interesting, you find interesting programs, but it's not a beacon of pluralistic democracy. But if you go out into the provinces, then again you see a bit of a different picture, because there are cities that have their own television stations where things are much freer, and they also discuss very negative local issues. But there's separate issues, which is about corruption in the media and the corruption of how far journalists are in the pay of local business people.
I think we've had time called on us, which means I say thank you very much indeed for coming and paying the hefty entrance fee.